Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining NCORE's Connect and Explore webinar series. We'll get started in just a few seconds. I'm going to let a few more folks join us for the webinar. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to today's Connect and Explore webinar. My name is Vaughn Doe, and I'm from the NCORE Coordinating Center, and I'll be facilitating today's presentation. Next slide. Today's Connect and Explore webinar will dive into NCORE's Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based Project, which is a test of a novel taxonomic meta-analytic method and involved creating taxonomies and a database of studies on childhood obesity interventions. Next slide. Today, we will be hearing from guest speakers on the importance of the childhood obesity evidence base to the field, how the database and taxonomies were developed, and we will be giving an introduction to a taxonomic meta-analysis and how the COEB can be used for your research. Following our presentation, there will be opportunities for questions. Next slide. So I'd like to take a moment to welcome our speakers today, if they'd like to come on camera and wave hello. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Deborah Young-Hyman from the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Heather King and Mackenzie Magnus from Mission Measurement, and Dr. Lori Scott Sheldon from the National Institute of Mental Health. Hello, everybody. Next slide. If you have a question for our speakers during the webinar, please feel free to write it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you need technical assistance, please let us know using the chat box feature on Zoom. And if you are having trouble with the chat feature, feel free to also reach out to us via email at ncore@fhi360.org, and we'll work with you to resolve the problem. Next slide. We will be live tweeting during the webinar, so if you're on Twitter, we encourage you to join the conversation by using the hashtag ConnectExplore and follow @NCORE on Twitter. Next slide. So we are going to start off our webinar with an interactive poll. So on your screen, you should see a poll. So let us know who you are. Select the best option that describes you. Are you a practitioner, researcher, a student, a public health professional, or other? All right, I'm going to end the poll here. But it looks like a majority of the people on the call today are considering themselves public health professionals. So welcome, and we hope you find this webinar useful. And we also have some researchers and a few students and practitioners on the line as well. So this will definitely be a helpful webinar for all of you. Next slide. So now I'm going to pass it on to our first speaker, Dr. Deborah Young-Hyman, who will be discussing the background of the COEB project.
Just wanted to say hello briefly, and then I'm going to turn my video off. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce the NCORE project, Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based, commonly referred to as COEB. The NCORE COEB project was undertaken to fulfill one of NCORE's major objectives, to synthesize evidence from prevention efforts to inform the field regarding promising intervention approaches to reduce rates of childhood obesity. COEB funded by OBSSR at NIH, also promotes a core OBSSR, or Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research, mission, which is to improve methods to make best use of evidence. COEB is a pilot test of taxonomic-based meta-analysis. The actual analysis is not a pilot, it is a full meta-analysis. Lori Scott Shelton will address that. This novel method was used to aggregate evidence regarding interventions to reduce BMI in young children and thereby reduce rates of childhood obesity. Next slide. Well, why is it important to use all possible evidence? As you will learn more during the presentation, commonly accepted data aggregation methods, i.e. meta-analytic methods for clinical trial results, restrict content and study type. Meta-analysis typically includes studies that meet specific trial design and evaluation criteria, conducting statistical evaluation of effect sizes of packaged interventions with commonly defined outcomes. The NCORE COEB project is an example of a novel taxonomic approach, as you've heard, to social science evidence aggregation, which classifies childhood obesity prevention interventions by characteristics such as study design, intended recipients, contextual elements, and intervention components. Thus, this method provides the opportunity to use all available evidence of successful approaches. We demonstrated that a taxonomic approach to social science evidence aggregation can make better use of evidence from diverse obesity prevention studies and initiatives conducted in diverse settings among diverse populations of children. Next slide. Again, as you will learn in much greater depth, the process of taxonomic meta-analysis starts with a scoping review of the relevant literature, the development of a design hierarchy, and coding system of reports to produce foundational taxonomies that include the type of study initiative, intended recipients as mentioned, contextual intervention elements, and evaluation schema. And it results in a living database that can be augmented as new evidence emerges. You will hear this multiple times. The process is formally documented in the special issue and includes a manual of procedures for use of the resulting database. Detailed steps for conducting the meta-analytic regression are provided as well, so that this method can be replicated. Our speakers today will inform you and hopefully aid in that process for your individual efforts. Using the resultant data set, a meta-analysis was used to conduct, as I said, a complete meta-analysis of the intervention efforts to reduce BMI in 2 to 5-year-old children in the United States. The three speakers you will hear today will describe these processes in depth in the hopes that you will adopt this method to answer your questions regarding prevention of childhood obesity. Next slide, please. This last slide shows an overview of the products that were produced by COEB. NCORE published this special supplement of childhood obesity that includes 4 papers that highlight the findings from the COEB project. And in addition, you will find commentaries from eminent researchers regarding how these methods add to our efforts to further prevention and intervention efforts. And without further ado, I turn this over to Heather and Mackenzie.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm Heather King, and I'm joined by my colleague Mackenzie Magnus at Mission Measurement. And our role in this was to develop the taxonomies that were the foundation for the meta-analysis and the things that Lori is going to talk about in a couple minutes. So I wanted to give everyone a sense of what does it mean? Next slide, please. What do we mean by taxonomy, and why is that important? So a taxonomy is just, really, it's just a list of concepts that have definitions attached to them. So a really, really simple taxonomy that you might be familiar with is if you, let's say you go to a website where you're shopping like Gap or something, or Banana Republic, there's a taxonomy that they use to organize all of the clothes, right? So you have shirts, pants, skirts, dresses, whatever. That's what a taxonomy is. It's not that complicated, but it's really important for use in this space because what the taxonomy allows you to do is open up the black box of an intervention. So you'll hear this term black box quite a few times because we think it's a really good analogy for the way things are sometimes done with interventions, where it's treated as this like whole thing. And that's good, but we also need to know what's happening inside that black box. And a taxonomy is a really good way to unpack that and uncover the things, the mechanisms, the activities, the components that are occurring inside an intervention that may lead to outcomes. So here's just a simple example of what this could look like. So here's our black, or in this case, gray box of childhood obesity prevention interventions. And then what we do is decompose these, and I'll get more into the details on how we do that in a minute, into these components. And it's important to know also that we standardize these. And that's important because then we know every time we talk about this purple box across all of these interventions that we're talking about the same thing. And just like, you know on the Gap website that pants are pants, and we are always talking about pants, and we know what that is, right? So it's really important to have this kind of common language so that we're all on the same page about what people are doing, because then you can aggregate across all of these studies that may use slightly different language, that might be talking about the same thing, but you wouldn't know unless you had a language like this to organize all of that information. So the idea here is that we are building a taxonomy that describes the things happening in this space. And it's not just the intervention components, it's also the outcomes that they're targeting. It's also characteristics of the intended recipients, so in this case, children, and the context around those interventions. So next slide, please. So we just briefly went over the entire process for this project, but I'm going to zoom in just on this part of it, which was the initial stage. So first, we nailed down the focus area. And as we all know, you have to do that, right, to put your arms around something. So we narrowed down to children ages 2 to 5. We're looking at children that have to be in the United States. Articles had to have at least one measure of BMI. They had to have been published since 1998. That was 20 years past when this started. We started in 2018. And we, as we said, we went through and found articles through our expert panel. We did keyword searches. We did a lot to find a good chunk of articles to start working with. And the idea is that we are using a grounded theory approach. So I'll talk a bit about that because it may not be familiar, but it's a method that is used in the social sciences. And the idea is that you're trying to uncover what the field is doing or what is contained in a body of information by letting the information tell you, rather than going in with an a priori framework that you're testing. So this is important because it does allow for some flexibility as things go. So I think we've mentioned already that this is a flexible taxonomy and it's intended to be living and we can add to it. And so that's because we took the approach of saying, like, we're going to be open to what we see and we're going to let it tell us what's going on, as opposed to, some people can make taxonomies, which is a legitimate way to do it, where they're saying, okay, I'm an expert or I'm working with experts and here's the things I'm expecting to see happening in an intervention, and then I'll go and verify whether or not I'm seeing that. This is a little bit different. So the way that we do this is we take a selection of articles. So in this case, we took 40 articles out of that 250 almost articles, and we stratified them by topic area. So we wanted to be sure that we were getting the whole range of types of interventions and different approaches that people might be using in those interventions. So we were sorting them by topics like sleep or nutrition or physical activity or screen time, things like that. And we took a random selection from each of those categories. And then we started to extract this information, which is the first step of building a taxonomy like this. So what does this look like? So if we're thinking about a intervention, what are all the things that are happening in that intervention? We need to start pulling that out. And it's kind of like just like tagging, if you're like social media tagging, it's to let somebody know this is the topic we're talking about. It's very similar to that. At this stage, we're looking at things that are very, very granular and very small. So I'll give an example of, let's say there's an intervention that's trying to change the food environment in a daycare center. So they would be doing really specific things, like they're going to be removing French fries, specifically French fries. That's, you know, what is happening in their intervention, from the lunch menu every day. Maybe they're going to be adding half water, half fruit juice to the fruit juice. So that's another thing that they're specifically doing. And so you start to collect these very granular, small examples over many, many articles. And that's only the first stage, because if you think about the purpose of this, the purpose is to have a standard definition of a component so that you can aggregate across many, many studies and know that you're using the same language, right? You want to know that this component in study A is the same as this component in study B, if that's what we've identified. So using a very fine-grained thing, like we're just going to say, okay, they took French fries off the menu, that's a little too idiosyncratic. But also saying like they changed the food options, that's also kind of too broad. So you need to get somewhere in the middle. So when you go through this process, especially if you're working with like 40, 50 articles, which is typical, you're going to come up with thousands and thousands of these little pieces of information about interventions. And then you start to aggregate those to build your taxonomy. So for example, the example I gave about like fruit juice, or maybe there's something about like removing soft drinks from a menu, or French fries, or fried food, or highly processed food, like all of those really idiosyncratic things can be grouped together into a component that would be something like reducing unhealthy food options. And that's kind of enough to capture those components, but it distinguishes it from something different, which might be like adding healthy food options, which is like a different thing. The spirit of that is a little bit different. So that's the process that we go through. And I'll give you a flavor in a couple minutes about like what that actually looks like. But I just want you to know that the philosophy here is to let this unfold from the evidence. And we're taking all of that into account, and we're organizing all of that into a taxonomy that then becomes the standardized common language. And we said that it was a living thing, which it is. So that means there's some iteration going on. So one of the first stages of iteration in this process was to have this reviewed by our external expert review panel. So I'll give you a glance at their names in a second. But really the purpose is to make sure that this taxonomy is reflecting what this field is doing, and that it is using language that will resonate with the field, because we really want this to be used, and we want it to reflect the work that all of you are doing. So it was really important to get input from folks external to the project to make sure that this was meeting those goals, and it was something that was really representing what they were doing. And then as time went on, and I think Lori will talk about this in a little bit, as you go through and actually apply the taxonomy to articles, you might find new things, because, you know, 40 articles is a really good, you know, we see like 90% of the taxonomy come through just from 40 articles, between 70 and 90%. But then as you do more coding and applying this taxonomy to evidence, then you start to see more things. And that's really good, because that is the way that the taxonomy can grow and be alive, so that as innovations are described in the field and in the research, then those can be added also. So we went through that whole process. We have our draft taxonomy. Then we did a full bibliography search to try to find as many articles as we possibly could that met these criteria. We then applied the taxonomy to those articles and those studies, and then we did the analysis that Lori will describe. So next slide, please. So here's our wonderful working group and external expert panel. So just to let you guys see this, there's probably some folks that you recognize on here. I think these are some leaders in this space, and they're incredibly helpful with all of their varying perspectives in making sure that this taxonomy was really representing their work. And I also just want to acknowledge in particular Dr. Leanne Birch, who unfortunately passed away through the course of this work, but we've dedicated all of it to her to recognize her contributions to the field, and we really appreciated her involvement in this. And so thank you to Dr. Birch and everyone that participated here. Next slide. So now I want to go through and just give you guys an overview of these different taxonomies. So I spent a lot of time talking about intervention components specifically. I was trying to just give you one example, and they don't overwhelm everybody, but there are really 4 different taxonomies that we built through this process. So the first one was outcomes, and that's really how we orient ourselves, is we think about like, what is the intended outcome? And that's one of the major ways that we can classify information. So What we're looking at were things like weight status. So you remember from our criteria earlier on the other slide that was actually required for inclusion. They had to have at least one measure of that. But there were other things too that were being measured, like physical activity, diet, and sleep. So it's important to see that we try to make these as standardized as possible. And so what we mean by that is that you can apply this definition to multiple studies. And that's another thing that Deborah mentioned. And then you can be confident that when you aggregate all of that information that you're talking about the same outcomes, and because there's a standard definition. And so it's a little bit kind of obvious with something like weight status, like that's kind of already has a bit of a standard behind it. But it's important in some of these other things because we're not saying like you have to measure it this way or it has to be calculated in this way. It's really just about like, is this the thing that they're measuring and does it meet this definition and does it jive with these examples? So that's where the standardization piece comes in. And that's, again, really important for the meta-analysis that Lori will describe. So here's the outcomes that we looked at. And then on the next slide, I can show you just a taste of what that looks like when you actually apply those to an article. So we've used the word coding. I just want to pause for a second and say like coding in our language is not like computer programming. It just is this tagging process. So just so everybody's on the same page with that. We go through and apply these taxonomies. We use these taxonomies to code the articles or tag the articles. And so I'm going to give you an example of what that looks like. So here is an excerpt from this paper on fruit and vegetable intake intervention. And essentially what happens is you go through and you read the article and you identify where they talk about these things. So here's where they're talking about the outcomes that they measured. So here's one on weight status, and then here's another one on diet. So this is where they say lunchtime consumption. There's much more detail to this, especially when in the effects coding that Lori's team had done. Like there's much more detail, but this is just an example to show you like here's how we might identify what these outcomes are. So we did this across all of the studies that we looked at in this project. And on the next slide, I will show you what the intervention components look like. So this is just a very small subset. There's actually 93 of these across 9 different categories, but that's way too much for a single slide. So I'll just give you an excerpt here to give you a sense of the types of things we're talking about to make this a little more concrete for you guys. So we had 9 categories. The categories are really just ways to conceptually group these things. So it's a little bit easier to navigate, but you can actually start to see the difference here in this, like what we're calling grain size, like the level of specificity, and how a category is a little bit too general. But once you get to the components, that's when you're really starting to see things coalesce into like very specific strategies or components or mechanisms or active ingredients. There's a lot of ways that people talk about these, but the idea is that this is a discrete thing that people are doing inside an intervention. And here we have some examples, and you can see like activities for supporting caregivers. That's not enough information in our minds, because what does that support look like and what form does it take? So the examples we have here are a little bit more specific. So for example, providing materials to support healthy eating patterns to caregivers. So that's something that's it's general enough that we can apply it to multiple studies, because they might be doing a really specific version of that, but the spirit of that is the same. So for example, some of those materials might be like a shopping list. I saw that in an article where they're giving caregivers like, here's the things that you can buy at the store that you know are healthy. Or maybe they're giving them recipe cards, or maybe they're providing videos that show, here's how you cook this meal so that you know how to do that now, and that's going to support healthy eating patterns. And that's different than having education about the importance of routines. So remember, we're talking about young children, so routines are very important. So that's very different from providing materials to support healthy eating patterns. And so getting into this level of specificity is really important, because then it gives you the power to be able to say, okay, yes, for example, let's say supporting caregivers is happening in these interventions, but what exactly does that look like? And you can see the differences in the strategies used depending on the intervention in question. So here's just a couple examples. You can see on our website the full taxonomy, and in the published articles there's much more information, but here's just a flavor of what that is. And then on the next slide, I wanted to show you this. I really like showing this slide because every time I do this, it's kind of mind-blowing how much information there really is in some of these articles. And as anyone who's read papers like this is an evaluation of the Hip Hop to Health Junior intervention. Like, there's some clues in the name of that, right? Like there's probably dancing, there's probably music involved, but like what is actually happening in that intervention? This is how you can know that, is you can apply one of these taxonomies. And so I like showing this because often in these articles, there's not a ton of information on the intervention compared to like a whole full-scale curriculum. There might be a page or half a page, but there's still a lot in there that you can extract. So just in this small paragraph, there's 8 different codes or intervention components that are described. And so this is helping us see the type of information, the power of something like this, because again, just kind of reading maybe a short description of Hip Hop to Health Junior might give you some information, like generally it's about dance and music and getting kids active, for example, but there's all this other stuff happening. And these things might be happening in lots of other interventions. And you wouldn't know that unless you did an exercise like this, because just based on the short descriptions, something like this intervention might sound really different from another one, but they might be using a lot of the same active ingredients or components. So here is just a handful of these. So things like using a research-based approach that's described, engaging both childcare providers and pediatrician healthcare folks in the intervention. That's another thing that happened. There was dual language instruction. There was a cultural tailoring that happened to the intervention. There was providing written resources to caregivers, financial incentives. So all of these things are happening inside. This is inside the black box now. We're looking in the black box. And then once you do that across many of these studies, you can find these patterns. And even just at the level of like, what's the frequency of some of these across this body of knowledge is really interesting, because you might, you're going to see things that you might not expect. Again, if you're just looking at the short description, or you have an idea of what the whole intervention is, there's a lot going on inside that you wouldn't know about unless you were applying one of these taxonomies. So on the next slide, I won't go into a lot of detail on these because it's a lot of information, but we also had the taxonomies about intended recipients and intervention context. So we all know how important those things are. It's really important to know who are the beneficiaries, the recipients here, and where is this intervention happening and what's kind of going on around it. So just for your information, the way that we parse those things apart is our intended recipients characteristics taxonomy. That's on the left here. That is all of the things about the people that are benefiting from the intervention. So in this case, it's the children. So these are kind of typical demographic type things. So like gender, age group, any physical or learning differences, race, ethnicity, technology access. That's maybe not a demographics thing, but that's also important. So these are all just things. And again, these are also standardized. And the idea is that these can also be applied to a range of studies, and you can have much more information on like, what are the range of children that were participating in the studies and potentially benefiting from them. Everything else that's not about the child is considered part of the intervention context taxonomy. And so that stuff is really important too. So it's things like where is this geographically? Is it a rural? Is it suburban? Is it urban? What's the setting there? Like, is this a daycare center? Is this a community center? Is this in the home? That's really important. Things like the background and education and experience of the person or people that are running the intervention, those facilitators. What's their gender? What's their language? What's their race, ethnicity? Things about like the school or the district or the community, depending on where we're talking about. What's the status of the parent or caregiver? What's their health status, employment status, their relationship status, language status? Like all of these things are really important when we're considering different interventions and which might be effective. So it's also really important to standardize these as well. All right, so on the next slide, I will start wrapping this up and handing it to Lori, but here is a screenshot from the final data set. And again, you can find this on our website, but this is what it looks like when you do all of this. You're applying the taxonomies to all of these studies, and then you get this really robust data set that we have a screenshot of here, and that is the raw materials that Lori and her team used to perform the taxonomic meta-analysis. So I will turn it over to Lori now so she can tell you about that.
All right, thank you, Heather. Can everyone see me? Okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today to discuss the NCORE Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based Project. And continuing with this theme, as Heather and Deb have already discussed, interventions to prevent childhood obesity historically have been evaluated using a black box approach. That is, we're focusing a lot of attention on the inputs and the outputs rather than the internal workings of that intervention. So today I'm going to provide an overview of one approach, a taxonomic meta-analysis that can begin to open the black box of interventions to prevent childhood obesity. This talk is meant to be an introduction to taxonomic meta-analysis and is by no means exhaustive. And for more details on the Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based Project, I recommend reading our special issue, including the supplemental materials, published in Childhood Obesity in September 2020. This talk, as well as any of my responses to questions, are my own and do not represent the views of the National Institutes of Health. Can you go back 2 slides, please? Or to that slide, thank you. In this talk, I will provide a brief overview of the similarities and differences between traditional and taxonomic meta-analysis. Then I will review meta-analytic best practices with particular attention to the use of a taxonomic approach. I will end by using the Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based Project as an example of how to conduct a taxonomic meta-analysis. Next slide, please. So the goal of any meta-analysis is really to determine the strength of the evidence in the scientific literature. And most commonly, the research findings of interest are in the form of a relationship between 2 groups on a specific outcome, such as the efficacy of the intervention relative to the control group on weight status. But we can also observe the effects of the intervention between 2 naturally occurring groups, such as girls and boys, or children who meet criteria for overweight or obesity. Next slide, please. The problem with this traditional meta-analytic approach is that we consider the intervention received by the group as a singular unit rather than a number of discrete components. So for example, we treat this blue intervention here with 6 different but related components, the same as the yellow intervention, which includes 3 entirely different components, all of which are targeting the exact same outcome. We then hypothesize that these interventions will produce the desired outcome, so change in behavior. Thus, a traditional meta-analysis has this more hypothesis testing orientation, focusing on the efficacy of the intervention as a unit, as a whole group, rather than looking at the individual components. Next slide, please. In a taxonomic meta-analysis, we are also interested in the overall impact of the intervention, but we're more interested in the components with the ultimate goal of determining the active ingredients or the key drivers of the intervention. These components may be effective alone or in combination with other components. So for example, we may find that a singular blue component is driving the effect, or a combination of components from the blue, yellow, red, and orange interventions may be producing the largest effect. These intervention components can also vary based on sample, such as proportion of children who meet criteria for overweight or obesity, context, such as the implementation setting, delivery channel, such as interventions delivered to the child, the parent, or the caregiver, and intensity, such as the frequency or duration of the intervention sessions. Thus, a taxonomic meta-analysis has this hypothesis generation orientation, which focuses on discovering the patterns of intervention components and the contextual factors that are associated with larger effects. Next slide, please. So what are the meta-analytic best practices, and how do taxonomic and traditional meta-analytic approaches differ? Next slide. Both traditional and taxonomic meta-analyses use best practices such as those reported in Johnson and Hennessy's 2019 Social Science and Medicine paper. These include formulating the research problem, including specifying the study eligibility criteria, conducting a comprehensive search and the selection of studies, coding studies for important features, including assessing quality and the risk of bias, calculating effect sizes, analyzing data, and interpreting the findings and dissemination. The meta-analysis database is then reanalyzed, further developed, and may be critically reviewed by the meta-analyst or scientific community. All of this feedback can lead to the repeating of any and all steps. Next slide. A taxonomic meta-analysis follows the same meta-analytic best practices, but it includes additional steps throughout the meta-analytic process. So in the problem formulation stage, where we lay out the detailed inclusion and exclusion criteria, a taxonomic meta-analysis can include interventions with a range of study designs, intervention types, and methodological quality. So for example, taxonomic meta-analysis is not limited to randomized controlled trials, as is typically found in traditional meta-analyses, because the differences in studies based on design can be modeled or controlled for in the analyses. Coding schemes to discretely describe elements of the study are generated early in the meta-analytic process, but unlike traditional meta-analyses, taxonomies are developed and refined throughout the meta-analytic stages and are informed by the scientific literature and leading experts in the field of study. So for example, the taxonomy for the Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based Project, as detailed by Heather, was developed from an initial set of studies recommended by NCORE, the expert panel, and other known experts, as well as from keyword searches of the scientific literature and reference lists. Furthermore, a taxonomy is refined not only throughout the initial meta-analysis, but is also considered a living document in that it can be expanded as the scientific literature in a particular field grows. And finally, in the data analysis stage, traditional meta-analyses often focus narrowly on the overall effect of the intervention. Taxonomic meta-analyses are also interested in the overall effect, but the focus is on modeling variation. And this is really important. We model variation as a function of the components of the intervention, the characteristics of the recipients, the context, and the methodological characteristics of the study. Taxonomic meta-analysis, therefore, can be a very powerful tool to identify the essential features of an intervention that can elicit greater behavior change. Next slide, please. The Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based Project was launched as a proof of concept, that is, to demonstrate the feasibility of developing and applying a taxonomy of intervention components to prevent childhood obesity. And in the next few slides, I will briefly review the methods, the analyses, and the findings from our taxonomic meta-analysis. Next slide, please. As we've stated previously, details of the Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based Project can be found on the NCORE website, and I would strongly encourage you to browse the website to learn more about the overall aims of the project, to access quite a bit of documentation, and to download and use the data set for teaching and research purposes. Next slide, please. A manual of procedures documents the meta-analytic best practices followed by our team while conducting the taxonomic meta-analysis. Please take a look at the document for the full methodological details. Next slide, please. So the key question driving this research was which intervention components are more effective to prevent obesity or improve weight status among children 2 to 5 years of age. Next slide, please. The study inclusion criteria were developed based on the population, interventions, comparisons, outcomes, and study design, or the PICOS framework, specifying that studies must sample children living in the US between 2 and 5 years of age, evaluate interventions targeting childhood obesity prevention, and include a control or comparison condition, assess body mass index, and be published between 2005 and 2019. So we initially included studies that sampled same-age children living outside the US and studies that assessed other outcomes such as physical activity and nutrition, as Heather described. Unfortunately, time and budget did not allow for a larger meta-analysis, But I would encourage others to consider expanding the database to include a more geographically diverse set of studies, assessing a broader range of outcomes. Next slide, please. Our comprehensive literature searches located 51 unique studies that reported on 58 interventions, meaning that 7 studies evaluated 2 different interventions. We also included 147 supplemental documents, such as published protocols, manuals, and ancillary papers that provided additional information for the 51 studies included in the database. The supplemental documents often provided more intervention details than the primary papers due to limited journal space, and were critical for characterizing the discrete components of the interventions. And in some cases, we wouldn't have been able to actually code those interventions without these ancillary or papers or protocols and manuals. Next slide, please. 2 trained coders independently extracted relevant study information, recipient characteristics such as age and gender, design and measurement features, intervention details such as dose and the number of sessions, and assessed the risk of bias using the Cochrane's risk of bias assessment tool. Most importantly, we used our taxonomy of intervention components as detailed by Heather to identify the presence or the absence of the distinct components. Intervention components were coded as absent if there was no clear evidence of the component that could be identified from the details provided in that primary study manuscript or in the supplemental documents for that particular manuscript. Next slide, please. Effect sizes, a method to quantify the magnitude and the direction of the difference between 2 groups, were calculated as the standardized mean difference controlling for baseline. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the effect size, it's equivalent to a standard normal distribution z-score. Next slide, please. The final database, which includes the extracted study, sample, and intervention details, intervention components, and effect sizes, can be found on the NCORE website. The next several slides will focus on the findings with particular attention to the taxonomy. Next slide, please. So as already mentioned, the final data set included a taxonomy of 93 intervention components grouped into 9 categories, as you can see here on the screen. 3 of these components were added to those generated from the training set that was earlier described. Next slide, please. Only 90 of the 93 components, however, were identified across the 58 interventions included in our final database. The 3 components that were not identified, including providing materials to support self-control in children, implementing earned income tax credit, and implementing policies regarding food or beverage costs. These components were not identified in the final data set because of changes to our inclusion criteria, specifically restricting studies to those that measured BMI, in which the components were no longer represented. So next slide, please. The average number of intervention components identified was 20, but there was a wide range of components across the interventions. The 5 most commonly reported components included the use of research-based approach or curriculum, providing written resources to caregivers, providing initial or one-time training opportunities to facilitators, providing education about nutrition and healthy eating patterns to caregivers, and providing curricular materials to facilitators. Next slide, please. All studies assessed BMI at the end of treatment, except for 1 study which did not include an immediate post-test, and 2 effect sizes were identified as extreme outliers. Therefore, we were left with 55 interventions contributing to the overall effect at the end of treatment. So this is after the initial intervention. From the output, you can see that the overall mean effect is a 0.10 with a fairly narrow confidence interval ranging from 0.02 to 0.18, indicating that children in the intervention group had a small but significant improvement in BMI compared to children in the control group at the end of treatment. Low heterogeneity was observed in this analysis as evidenced by the I-squared value and the confidence intervals. Next slide, please. This figure represents a forest plot of effect sizes and 95% confidence intervals for each intervention contributing to the analyses at the end of treatment, with the average or overall effect size indicated by the blue diamond here at the bottom of the screen. We also found a small but significant improvement in BMI at the last follow-up assessment in the 14 studies that assessed BMI at a delayed time point. Subsequent analyses, however, focused on the end of treatment due to the limited number of studies with a delayed assessment. Next slide, please. Meta-regression was used to examine whether intervention components independently impacted the overall BMI at the end of treatment. Interventions that delivered more rather than fewer activities to support behavior change were more successful in lowering BMI. We also found 3 specific components: engaging caregivers in praise or encouragement for positive behaviors, providing education about the importance of screen time reduction to caregivers, and engaging pediatricians or other healthcare providers in delivering content contributed to the success of the intervention. Next slide. These 3 components were then simultaneously entered into a multiple meta-regression model in which only providing education about the importance of screen time reduction to caregivers emerged as a significant moderator of BMI. This model was significant and accounted for 89% of the variance in the change of BMI. Next slide, please. This model held even after adjusting for multiple testing using the permutation test with 5,000 permutations, confirming the importance of providing education about screen time reduction to caregivers and lowering BMI in children 2 to 5 years of age. So at this point, you may be wondering why other significant features of the studies not discussed in this talk, such as recipients and design and measurement characteristics, were not included in this model, but this was due to multicollinearity and the overfitting of the models. However, we were able to conduct some exploratory analyses using one feature that could be included in the models, that is socioeconomic status, or SES, indicating that including SES in a model which also included screen time reduction showed that studies sampling fewer children of low SES and providing education on screen time reduction to caregivers were more likely to reduce children's BMI at the end of treatment. After adjusting for multiple testing using the permutation test, however, we found inconclusive evidence that socioeconomic status was associated with the changes in BMI above and beyond screen time reduction. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, this is the first meta-analysis to use a taxonomic approach to identify components used in early childhood obesity interventions. Limitations of the available data made it difficult to fully realize the benefits of the taxonomic meta-analytic approach, but I strongly encourage each of you to continue our work by building upon the existing database to identify important intervention characteristics and components that may accelerate our efforts to reduce the rates of childhood obesity. Now, before I end, I'd like to acknowledge the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research of the National Institutes of Health for funding this research. This research represents a collaborative effort between research, industry, and government, and we thank you all for your contributions. Finally, I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the staff of my Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis Research Methods team at the Miriam Hospital and Brown University for their contributions to the project. And now I'll turn it over to Deb, who will provide some concluding remarks.
I'm just gonna turn my video on for a moment. First, I want to thank, oops, here we go again. I want to thank our presenters today for their excellent presentations. I know every time I personally hear this, I learn new things and the concepts become clearer. But what are the implications of this? Well, it's not just researchers, but clinicians, policymakers, and implementers can utilize the database and use the methods to answer their own customized questions regarding successful intervention strategies to prevent childhood obesity. Each of us has our own resources and constraints, and this method allows us the opportunity to take them into account. As has been said numerous times, the database can be updated as more evidence is generated and novel intervention strategies tested. And the other thing is that this method can be used to aggregate evidence in diverse social science topics and provides adjunctive information to traditional meta-analytic methods. One of the things we're interested in knowing is if you put taxonomic meta-analysis side by side with traditional methods, what is the difference in the information and what is the overlap? What is confirmatory? Finally, and importantly, based on this successful effort, and again, I want to applaud Lori and her team and Mission Measurement, Heather and Mackenzie and their team for this successful effort. As a result, the NIH is currently seeking to do a replication of this method using other topics in the social science research realm. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. And we'll go to the chat box. And I guess, Vaughn, are you going to moderate that?
I will. So thank you so much, Deborah, Lori, and Heather, and Mackenzie for your presentations. And now it's time for our Q&A. We'll try our best to get to all of the questions today, and I see a few have been submitted, so I'll go ahead and read the first one from Vivian Gabor. How difficult or easy was it to obtain supplemental documents from the authors to obtain the information you needed for coding? Lori, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. So as Vivian probably is aware, it's always a challenge to get some of these supplemental documents. The ones that are published in journals obviously are much easier to get. Some authors also include their intervention manuals on their own websites, or they have a manual available or published protocol. With the new requirements for clinical trials, to include all your information in the clinical trials record, it made it a little bit easier to get some of this information. But it is something that's always a challenge. And so I would encourage people to continue to share if they're already sharing their manuals, to continue to do so, and that to make their manuals available so that we can look more closely at some of these intervention characteristics.
Thanks, Lori. So just as an FYI, we're going to try our best to get to all of the questions today, and if there are any remaining and we haven't had a chance to answer them, we're going to ask our speakers to respond in writing, and we'll include that in a follow-up email that we'll be sending to participants that join today's program. All right, let's see. So I'm gonna ask a question myself. If there are a few grad students on the call, to any of the panelists on the call today, if they're interested in using the COEB, where do you recommend they start for a new grad student or someone first starting their PhD? Would anyone like to answer that question?
I'll take a stab at it. The first thing I would say is find a really good mentor. This is a complex process, multi-step process that has multiple pieces to it. I go back to grounded theory, which I personally had never heard about when we started the process and needed to learn that. And I'm pretty senior, if you can see the gray hair. And then there is the complex meta-analytic process, statistical meta-analytic process. And further, there is the input from the field itself. Heather talked about that, about a common language, developing a common language and the needed buckets for that language in order to make the results of this kind of meta-analytic process meaningful. So that's why I started by saying, find a really good mentor. And I applaud our speakers who did the heavy lifting for all this. And I don't know, Lori, whether you, now that you're at the NIH, have an ability to point people to some resources.
Yeah, so as a graduate student, and assuming that the graduate student is not familiar with meta-analysis, I would start with some early readers. So Practical Meta-Analysis by Lipsey and Wilson is an excellent resource if you want to learn just basically about the meta-analytic process. A taxonomic meta-analysis is a little different. I personally do not know if there are any manuals on how to do this, really. I mean, maybe Heather, you're aware. I'm not aware of any published manuals or textbooks or anything that kind of gives you this flavor. I mean, really looking at our manual of procedures might be a good place to start to learn about a taxonomic meta-analysis and also to review other published papers in the field.
Yeah, I think that's the place to start, Lori. I don't think this is in textbooks yet. It's fairly new, and obviously it's the first time this has been applied to this field.
Absolutely.
We have done this work in a number of other disciplines, so various parts of education or domestic violence or youth development, some other areas, but this is probably, this set of papers is definitely the most comprehensive detail of the methodology.
So you both seem to be saying reading the supplement and ancillary materials on the NCORE website would be quite helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is I'm going to ask this to anybody, feel free to answer. Are there further specific topics in childhood obesity research that would benefit from this approach? Any examples of future analysis we can do?
Well, the one thing I'd really like to say, and I said this in my talk, is that I really want to see it expanded beyond the US, right? I'd like to see what this looks like when you look at studies from around the globe. Does the taxonomy hold up? Are there different components or features that are more important in one culture versus another? I'd just like to see a little bit more depth, breadth and depth to this approach.
Yeah, so consistent with NCORE's mission, NCORE is interested in looking at all varieties of successful intervention approaches. And one of the emphasis has been on physical activity and on the food environment per se, food deserts versus the built environment versus social determinants of health. All those components are included in the database. The absolute elegance of the database is in the process that Heather described in terms of both the individual components of the interventions as well as the ability to identify their specificity of intent. And I want to say that again because I think that's something that's easy to gloss over if you're not used to taxonomies. It's the specificity of intent of the intervention components. So, you know, if you're studying physical activity interventions, you know, you might just choose a very specific type of intervention like walking, increasing walking, and use that as your outcome, or using WIC or SNAP, some of the national policy interventions as well. And that speaks to Lori's comment about other countries, whether this holds up in countries that have nationwide healthcare systems and food support. The opportunities are endless.
Thank you so much, Deborah. and Heather and Lori and Mackenzie. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to move us on. Again, please submit any questions and feel free to email them to Encore at fhi360.org or any of those email addresses that you see on the screen right now. And I just wanted to give a huge thank you to all of our speakers again today, Deborah, Heather, Mackenzie, and Lori. Great presentations, and thank you all for attending. Just so everybody knows, the recording will be posted on our website, and we will email them out to all participants. And when the webinar ends today, please take a moment to complete our brief survey to help us shape our future webinars. Thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks for coming.